Hey there, this is Dan, you're watching the Salty Sea, and I'm here with the casual tier list, a video I've been threatening to put out for, I don't know, 6, 7 months at this point, and always too much of a coward to actually do so. The reason for that is that how you're going to grade casual fun is, how do you do it, really? I've kind of struggled with that for a while. I do have a bunch of starter list videos back in my archives that you can take a look at that have some sweet casual lists that I think are like legitimately really fun. I haven't tested all of them, but they're sort of built around sort of fun interactions that I think are really sweet. The issue with that is, I skew a little bit Johnny. Someone else might skew a little bit Timmy. They just want to sort of run the biggest, baddest things, right? Some people, being spiky is their idea of fun. It really varies person to person. So I wanted to find kind of a way to talk about these factions, though, in a way that talks about a lot of what they offer as sort of something to sink into, as opposed to just, their competitive power, which sneak peek, you will be getting somewhat updated sort of pre-Adepticon competitive tier list pretty soon here. But not just competitive power, but sort of flexibility, aesthetics, things like that. So in theory, right here, competitive power isn't going to matter. The issue there is that in practice, a lot of the lowest tier competitive factions, the reason they're so low tier is that they're just so dysfunctional in game, and that will take away from most people's casual fun as well. One thing that Rob, the Honest Wargamer, will talk about a lot is that competitive balance does affect casual balance, just in that if it's, if something is just awful bad, sometimes you can't even make it work really in casual games either. So that can be an issue and something that I wanted to test for here. So I wanted to make this kind of as objective as possible. So one thing, list building options, sort of what kinds of things you can do with this faction, and also sweet tricks, what kinds of sort of, one is how many options do you have, and one is sort of how memorable are the silly things you can do. And then we've also got, a few things that are going to catch more of the Timmy angle in terms of ally potential and narrative heroes. And then, those things are slightly correlated with being strong on the table, but I think you'll see not 100% by any means. Aesthetics are also here and are hard to evaluate, really. So I wanted to have it be a small but relevant piece of the pie. And the reason for that is, one, aesthetics do matter to most people, but it's going to be hard to say, for example, I think this looks bad, and then you're going to say, well, I think it looks great, so you quiet down. So in trying to make it more objective, I sort of made this little rubric about just kind of how recent are the sculpts, how well do they hold up, and, I'm not one of those people who sort of searches eBay for old out-of-print sculpts. I generally think most of the new stuff is better, although, again, that's not always going to be true, as you'll see. There are certainly some things that I think have held up well to the point of looking better than some of the new stuff that's out there. So I tried to kind of give this at least some shape of structure so that my personal bias for or against a faction would only swing it 2 or 3 points there, and pretty rarely make the difference in terms of what tier it's in. So really, this is just an opportunity to sort of talk about the factions, what they offer you in Warcry, stuff like that. I hope you can enjoy. So I'm going to start doing it alphabetically. So we're going to start with Beasts of Chaos. Cool thing about Beasts of Chaos is they have a lot of build options and flexibility. Now, some of those are traps if you want to start winning, but for a lot of people, that's going to be fine. They have very memorable leaders. So the Doom Bull is absolutely a fan favorite in this game. If you play it, I think you're going to love it. One issue with the Doom Bull that just really takes Beasts of Chaos down in my eyes is that now, you might have heard a little hint of this in my last video, but the GW Doom Bull is not one of the 10 best Minotaur with big axe sculpts that you can find on the internet. Just not even in the top 10, which to me just brings the entire faction down a notch. Some other issues is that you have a couple leaders with good abilities, but sort of outside of those, you're not up to sort of the most interesting tricks. And the old sculpts are just across the board, sort of everywhere. I think because of all the mechanical options, I think you could absolutely justify putting them in B here, but just the fact that you literally cannot avoid running something pretty old and ugly is too bad. I do think, though, the fact that you can go with Gores, Ungor Raiders, you can do all elite options with Dragon Ogres and or Bulgors. I think that part is really cool, and if you don't mind just collecting really ancient old sculpts, I think you can have fun with Beasts of Chaos. Bonesplitterz. For reference, by the way, S tier, what does that even mean in a non-competitive tier list? Who knows? But S is going to be some incredible, I think the most Warcry factions in Warcry. A and B are both going to be pretty amazing. I think you'll sort of get what I mean as I go on with that. C is going to be something where I would say only go into it if you just love that faction for lore reasons or aesthetic reasons, something like that. Because there are things about it, whether, in my opinion, Beasts of Chaos being so old, or other ones where there's just certain huge flaws that sort of can ruin some people's enjoyment of a faction in game. So just listen to sort of how I interpret it, narrate it, and you can make your own decision there. What puts Bonesplitterz in D is that they can just be very difficult to do a lot of different things with on the board. So they have a lot of options in terms of number of units, but those options don't fit together very well in terms of making lists. And they also, they don't really look that different from each other. I think we make fun of Fyreslayers all the time in the community for being all sort of naked baby dwarves that look the same. These are just sort of naked teenage orcs that look the same. Now, that's not true of their leaders. Some of their leaders have some incredible sculpts, but otherwise it's all very old across the board. The one kind of saving grace there is you do get access to the Wa, which is one of the more memorable and awesome abilities in the game, and it does make Bonesplitter leaders into really good allies for other factions. So if you love Bonesplitterz, I'm just noticing that I put Bonespitters on the slide, but if you love Bonesplitterz, I would say ally them into other factions where you can use their memorable abilities. You can play the heroes that actually have some kind of more interesting sort of verve to them, and you can have a lot of fun with them that way. But on their own, I just think that there's just too many barriers to kind of making the game work with them. I think a lot of people are going to be a little upset with that. My relationship with Bonesplitterz has been a little combative throughout the history of the channel. I know a lot of people sort of held up that Savage Orc box as one of the best ways to get into Warcry. I could not disagree more. There are plenty of other boxes that give you one box warbands that I think will give you sort of more play on the table, more things to do. Okay, let's get into Cities in Corvus Cabal. Cities of Sigmar are incredible in this game. They give you essentially infinite customizability, and the warbands all work and have a purpose and an identity. You have multiple options at every point in the curve, and by that what I mean is you have multiple sort of leader options, you have multiple elite options, you have multiple cheap options, and then you have multiple options for paradigms of how to run them in terms of your abilities, where you can just make hundreds of warband, I could have this channel be only dedicated to Cities of Sigmar warbands that you can build, and I wouldn't have run out of videos yet. That's how deep this faction is and how much play it's got with it. In my opinion, the only thing that's really holding it back from being sort of the top of S tier, the number one faction in the game, as far as sort of what a player can expect to be able to sink into with it, is those awful, awful sculpts that are kind of all over the place in Cities of Sigmar. Listen, if you love old German guys with massive heads, go for it. You know, like if that aesthetic pleases you, you should go for it. They do have some stuff that I like. I know there's, you know, not every sculpt there is ancient, but you know, a lot of the sculpts and a lot of the different factions have, you know, just a lot less dynamism than what you can generally expect in this game. Yeah, just a lot less going for it in a lot of ways, just from again, an aesthetic perspective. But I spent way too much time on that because I don't want it to overshadow the fact that mechanically, Cities of Sigmar are the most incredible sandbox that you could ask for. You get so many options, and then, you know, aesthetically, even though I dissed all their sculpts, the fact that you can go, you know, wood elves being so different from the dark elves, being so different from the dwarves, being so different from the humans, I think there's a lot to play with there. Now, Corvus Cabal, gonna go C tier. So aside from the competitive build, Corvus isn't really doing much. You know, the Warcry warbands, the bespoke warbands, kind of have this issue a little bit, pretty often, where they just do the one thing that's in the box, and that's it. There are a few that will have multiple play styles, so I don't want to generally dock them too much for that. But Corvus, they don't really have anything other than just being pretty good as far as mechanically. So, you know, the Shrike Talon, you know, it does have this mini game where, you know, try to climb up and then jump down. But at least in my opinion, the mini game's not that fun, except for when it's just like you happen to start there and then it's just really powerful. In general, too, like the you know, you only get one option for the cheap unit, and then, you know, you get multiple weapon options. That's okay, but they still look pretty similar. They don't really have a different feel for them, except that one of them is really, really powerful. So the one kind of saving grace for Corvus Cabal is that they have just an incredible look to them that, to me, is iconic of Warcry. It is, when I think Warcry, I think the look of Corvus Cabal. I think that's what keeps them out of casual D tier for me. Because mechanically, I think they're powerful, and that's kind of all they've got going for them. But, you know, there's plenty to like about this faction, just as far as if you love the aesthetic, they are at least powerful. This can be a great competitive faction for you to run if you just get the double box and never look back. Cypher Lords kind of have some similar situations to Corvus. There's very little flexibility. Everything is kind of expensive in Cypher Lords. I wonder sometimes if they are paying for that ability, just in terms of how expensive they are. Because the Cypher Slide is one of the absolute coolest abilities in the game. It also works on Nurglings, which makes the Thrall Master a particularly or particularly interesting ally if you're in Nurgle. So that part, I think, is a real saving grace to them. Again, you know, C tier is not bad unplayable factions here. C tier is just factions that have more limitations to them than the other ones. They have really incredible elite sculpts, but I'm really sorry for this hot take, but their chaff models look really odd. they're all wearing diapers. I don't know where that aesthetic choice came from. Why they chose diapers, I don't know. Especially when the leader is so incredible, and then the number 2 I think looks really good as well. But everyone else is just wearing diapers, and I don't get why. Someone please explain to me if there's sort of a really compelling reason for it. But otherwise, I just don't get it. So anyway, back to sort of mechanically. Again, the Cypher slide is incredible. That's the ability, the teleport ability. But it's kind of a one-trick pony. Now, it gets to be at the top of C because its one trick is really cool. But I just can't put it any higher given how amazing some of the other factions you're going to see are. We're kind of getting through some of the lower tier stuff kind of early. Now, Darkoath Savagers. Oh my god. So, one, they are the best home in the game for whatever your favorite dice-hungry hero is. So, did you buy the Ogor and Myrmidon? Did you buy the Mindstealer Spheranx? Do you have a Contorted Epitome? Do you have any Chaos hero at all that you just love the hero? If you don't love the faction, Darkoath Savagers is the best, even if you do love its faction, honestly. Darkoath Savagers is just the best home for showcasing your favorite hero. And they get so many points for that for me. Because, again, Warcry, I often focus on the competitive aspects of the game, but most people play Warcry casually and narratively. And so, in my opinion, building that relationship with your favorite sort of chaos hero is a really sweet thing to do that a lot of people do in this game. And Darkoath Savagers are the thing that will make it look the best. The reason for that is they have that ability where you can roll dice this round to get extra wild dice next round. And the first round is generally sort of a posturing round, especially in Red Harvest with all that terrain. So, if in your first round you're just investing in the next round, by then, rounds 2, 3, and 4, your favorite hero is just going to go crazy. It's going to get to do everything that it loves to do at the highest level that it likes to do it. You're going to have a great time with that hero. Now, aesthetically, I think that they are an incredible execution of an aesthetic that I don't really like, to be honest. But taking away sort of my preference for it, I think they've just done an incredible job as far as the detail on the sculpts, the kind of posing on the sculpts. There was a while when to be dynamic, Games Workshop would kind of have to be sort of wild and all over the place with a sculpt to kind of show their again, their dynamism. I think they've kind of, with the Darkoath, they've kind of gotten over that. They're dynamic with also being like powerful and imposing. I've seen some really incredible paint jobs of them, and I also love how their leader shops at the same store as the Ironjawz Mega Boss. So yeah, just a lot to love there. They're also one of the only bespoke warbands with multiple playstyles, which I think they should get huge points for as well. In my Red Harvest video, so not to sort of bog this one down with too much, but in my Red Harvest video, I talk about how they've really got 3 different playstyles you can jump into, and I think that's really cool. It absolutely gives them a ton of replayability, and is going to be more likely to tempt you to get a second box, even though they're not that competitively overwhelming. So yeah, just a lot to love there. Now for Daughters of Khaine, I think this is one of the most underrated factions in Warcry. They have a ton of options, some of them competitive, some of them not. And all of those options have fun tricks. So it's not just that you are putting different fighters in your warband. It's also that you're sort of creating new playstyles by doing so, which I think is really great. Also, the Bloodrack Medusa is one of the most intense heroes to fight against in the game. Its ability to kind of lock you down from 2 inches away and hit you with its 2-inch reach spear is pretty terrifying. So they've got a ton of different sweet hero options. they've got, in my opinion, absolutely iconic sculpts. Some of, again, maybe not think Warcry, but when I think AOS, I think Daughters of Cain. They're weirdly not that popular in the community. I shouldn't have said unpopular there. They're not unpopular, but Daughters of Cain just doesn't have a lot of players, especially given how powerful they've been throughout their existence in AOS. So, I get that some people aren't as into the aesthetic as I am. I know that some people are sort of upset by and turned off by, for example, the witch elf aesthetic. And while I disagree, I absolutely respect the reasons why that would be. I totally get it. So, again, not a fully endorsed by everyone kind of aesthetic, and that's part of why I think they're so underrated in this game. So if you like them at all, just go all in with them in Warcry, because you really can just do so many things with them. Flesh Eater Courts I think are really cool. You only get one chaff option, so the backbone of your warband is always going to be the same. But the variance among the elites really drastically changes your playstyle, and in really just like interesting ways, where each different sort of option for an elite has legitimate reasons why you'd want to play them. You mostly hear people talk about the Infernal and the sort of Crypt Flayers, the Flyers, because that's what's most competitive. But all of the options for playstyle are pretty functional. Like, I wouldn't say any of them are traps. The sort of Chosen of the King thing that you can build is really cool. They also have some of the most interesting allies in the game because of their abilities. They've got sort of movement abilities and AoE buff abilities that a lot of factions, would kill for. And the fact that, only a few factions can actually ally them because they're in death is, just a big loss for some of the other factions in the game. So I think they get points for that. The fact that, that you have tons of reasons if you have Flesh Eater Courts to sort of bring them into other places. And it's not just like the way it is with Bonesplitterz, where it's like to play it at all, you want to bring it somewhere else. It's like it works really well in Flesh Eater Courts, and it works really well in other places, which I think is great. The sculpts are kind of on the older side. They're pretty generic, in my opinion, but lovable. I like them better than a lot of new stuff that's come out. But I do have to dock them for the fact that there's not a ton differentiating them from, just your average monster, creepy creature feature thing, right? There's nothing really separating a Crypt Flare from just kind of something you saw in a Brian De Palma movie once. Now, I love painting them. I think that my Flesh Eater Courts are probably the best thing I've ever painted. I'm incredibly proud of them in a way that I'm not that proud of most of my warbands. But you have to put your own love into them. They're sort of a blank slate, which is cool. But something that you have to get into. Now, Fyreslayers are sort of the biggest example of being competitively problematic can kill you even in casual settings. Because power level isn't supposed to matter in terms of this video, but Fyreslayers are just unplayable. They're just completely unplayable unless you absolutely love the faction. The fact that they're so slow, their movement ability meant to sort of help them out is one of the least powerful movement abilities in the game. Their sculpts are pretty recent, but like wildly unpopular. Other content creators have done sort of aesthetic surveys of what players like in the game, and Fyreslayers always come in last. There's the meme that every Fyreslayer looks the same. I think it's a shame, because I actually think that the 2D art for Fyreslayers, like in the battle tomes, is some of the best stuff GW has ever commissioned. I think it's really amazing. But it doesn't come out all the way on the tabletop, and that's okay. so while the aesthetics are an issue, that isn't the only reason I would steer someone away from Fyreslayers. It really is just how they play. Their abilities generally aren't that powerful. Duty unto Death is kind of cool, but just in terms of power, they really struggle. They don't have any real list building flexibility either. The pieces don't fit together well. They're not they don't have a playstyle even, which, sorry, I just can't even, it's even just hard to describe how unplayable they are without just resorting to terms that don't mean anything, like unplayable. Like, they're just hard to actually play, to actually even function with. I would say, yeah, they are the least user-friendly faction in the game. From them to one of the most user-friendly factions in the game is Gloomspite Gits. They have the wildest set of abilities in the entire game. The fact that they brought the Gobapalooza into Warcry and then put the effort in to give each one of them a distinctive ability, in my opinion, is just incredible. There's also the fact that you can build tons of different options. You can do like all squig warbands because the squig herder is only 45 points, combos with the squigs, so it gives you like a cheap option to give yourself some numbers, but then you can also run all these squigs, which would normally be kind of rough to play on their own, but you've got this good movement ability. They've got tons of squig riders. They've got this whole spider faction that if it were on its own I would put in D tier next to Fyreslayers, but the fact that it's just like a side of fries you can put onto your Gloomspite thing is pretty sweet. They've got just a ton of different abilities. Netters are kind of a classic sort of competitive thing from sort of early on. Just an incredible amount of stuff that you can do for them. They're amazing as allies because the Squig Hopper boss is sort of one of the examples I use for like the classic dragon in the game of something that can kill chaff models in one hit while also flying around the board. But they also bring in other heroes really well, like any ogre hero will combo with the Gobapalooza really well. The Mega Boss combos with the Gobapalooza really well. The only thing keeping them from being number one in the game, in my opinion, is there's really only two options for like a good narrative leader. Now those two options are amazing. The Boingrot Bounder boss and the Squig Hopper boss are just amazing in kind of campaign and in just in game. But a lot of their leaders, other than those two, are just not very good, or they're like they have abilities that are fun but I don't know, tough to sort of stake a campaign around, in my opinion. The other thing is it's hard. So they have some of the most amazing sculpts in sort of recent Games Workshop sort of products, but they also have some pretty old ones, and it can be kind of tough to avoid having a few kind of old derpy stuff. So you do need to sort of gauge your preference for having goblins, putting together some goblins, painting them. But it's not like having that in Age of Sigmar where, to play Gloomspite in a functional way, you kind of have to have 120 goblins. In this case, you only have to have 6 or 7 if you want. So that's not as bad as it would be in another game. It's just, it's going to be hard to have a warband of entirely brand new stuff. Okay, now, Idoneth are going to go right in there, right next to Gloomspite. And the reason for that is, first, they have incredible cutting-edge sculpts. Some of the most sort of crazy stuff in the game I've shown. I think it's the Soul Render here that has the fish hanging out with him. It's some of the stuff that, when you put it in game stores, it draws new players in more than just about any other faction, and that they see that and go, wow, like it's even possible to have that in a war game. Now, not all of that is in Warcry, and a lot of people dislike eels specifically, which is a very Warcry distinctive thing. But some of it is, right? Like you can get the Achelian King into Warcry with its incredible mount. I think Reavers, sort of the Idoneth archers, have this incredibly dynamic pose all throughout that line. Namarti are really solid. Namarti have just the coolest weapons. So just in general, I just think the aesthetic of this is incredible. And one of the things, beyond just me liking it, to me, it's one of the things that sets Age of Sigmar out as a setting, and by extension, Warcry. They also have an incredible amount of sort of build around abilities and playstyles. A lot of their foot heroes have real purpose to them, that they get overshadowed in terms of what I talk about on the channel, what you'll see people talk about in Reddit or Discord, where it's like mostly people talking about running Namarti with the Eels or with the Akelian King. But each of those foot heroes, or almost all of them, has like a real ability that changes how you're going to play the game. And I think that that's incredible to see. So even though they only have 2 options for kind of your cheap foot soldier, the fact that it's a solid glass cannony sword person or a really solid shooter, and both of them are good in their own right, is part of what lets you mix and match in a way that just gives you a ton of customization. And then, whether you want to sort of build around High Tide as sort of a crazy combo warband, or whether you want to, if you want to have like an elite warband with the defensive eels, you can absolutely do that. This is a faction that works as an elite warband better than most do. So yeah, an incredibly staggering variety of abilities, playstyles. I was trying to dock them for something, to have something critique to say. Justifying them in the 8 points is tough. Every time you hear about Idoneth in the lore, they're sort of coming out of the ocean and going to, some sort of citadel that's nearby. There's no oceans. You can look at the map of the 8 points. I'm pretty sure there's no ocean there. None of the sort of ways in or out of the 8 points sort of borders an ocean, I think. So justifying them there can be tough, but who cares? Just make it up on your own if you're playing narratively. So yeah, I kind of do actually wish I'd put these above Gloomspite, but whatever. Iron Golems. Now they do actually have more variety than most. You can kind of build your Iron Legionnaires a few different ways. You could sort of give yourself more of the dwarf. The Ogre Breacher is sort of a thing that you can focus on. The problem is just that all of them are traps. There's so little to do with Iron Golems that kind of works. And even if you kind of specialize and run as many Drill Masters as you can, that's, if you don't know, Drill Master is sort of the whippy Iron Golem, and it's the only fighter in Iron Golems that's kind of legitimately powerful in any sort of way. Even if you do focus on Drill Masters, say you bought 4 boxes of Iron Golems and you built a bunch of Drill Masters, you'd still not have a great time because their abilities are awful. They don't have a single ability that's good in any way. And I don't just mean good in a competitive sense, but good in terms of, once you've been playing a little bit, like how it affects the game in a memorable way or something. They just don't have a single one. The one positive to them, though, is that they are the most Warcry of all Warcry models, and I think a lot of people love them for that reason. Also, their playstyle just being very basic is good for new players. I think it was smart for them to put it in the base game. I think that Warcry, when just played with everyone, when played at an introductory level, Iron Golems are so introductory that I do think that they make a good start for people. The issue being that, oh boy, once you've played a few games of Warcry, it can just be tough to use those Iron Golems, man. Like, I've got my Iron Golems warband. I tried to make them work a few times. I've never seen them win. And so it is to the point where being so dysfunctional in game does kind of take them out even in a casual setting. But the aesthetic is amazing. I believe it's amazing. You see so many good paint jobs out there of Iron Golems. You could do an entire video just reviewing Iron Golems paint jobs, and it would work great. So there is that. These D tier factions, None of them are so bad. I don't have an F tier in this video because there isn't a single faction in Warcry where it's so bad that if you love, love, love the aesthetic, you would still not want to play it. A lot of people love, love, love the aesthetic of Iron Golems, and they are playable if that's true. But man, a lot of factions in the game, you have to go really far out of your way to power them down enough so that Iron Golems can be fun going into them. And I do think that that's a problem casually because it means that your opponents can't run what they like for you to be able to have fun with them, which, you know, is kind of a bummer from a casual sense. Ironjawz. I think Ironjawz are sweet. They have real list building problems, where, you know, the fact that Ardboys coming in at 110 points, it just means that their pieces only fit together in so many ways, which can really limit your creativity when you're kind of trying to build an Ironjawz list. And it's a shame because they have really sweet abilities. They have distinct playstyles based on, like, Gore Gruntas do really different things than Brutes do. Something helmed by a War Chanta is going to feel really different than something helmed by a Mega Boss, which is also going to be feeling different than something held by the Gore Grunta boss. So for that reason, you know, I can't dock them that much because they function really well in terms of putting their stamp on the game, even though they have all of these problems, right? Like a ton of their models only have 3-inch movement. They don't fit together well, but because they're just incredibly memorable with what they actually do achieve on the board, I think that that's good. They also have a thing that Iron Golems and Fyreslayers lack when you're thinking about sort of really slow, you know, weak in terms of competitive models, which is once they do get into combat, they're incredible. Which those other kind of slow factions, not all of them can say that. Ironjawz can absolutely say that, and you can get them into combat a little bit better than their 3-inch movement would suggest, just because of that that wah ability that you have. So you can kind of do some things with them, and you can have some really fun games, just knowing that you will get auto losses for all sorts of things. They also have really incredible sculpts. I think that this is another kind of iconic AOS faction. The issue there is I couldn't give them as much credit for those incredible sculpts as I'd like to, because Ardboys are not as amazing as the rest of Ironjawz in terms of their sculpts, and you can't really build a list without a bunch of Ardboys. I mean, you can. I put a Oops All Brutes list in my starter video. You can do it, but it doesn't really work. You kind of need to have Ardboys, which in my opinion kind of takes down the kind of aesthetic advantage that you get from having that incredible range of Ironjawz sculpts, because most warbands that you make from Ironjawz are only going to have 1 or 2 of those amazing sculpts in them. Otherwise, they're just going to be all Ardboys, which I think is too bad. But that's just one small issue. Everything else about Ironjawz I think is really solid. Khainite Shadowstalkers, aesthetically, I think is incredible. One of my favorite aesthetic factions in the game. I couldn't sort of elevate them any higher, you know, but they are just very recent, very cool. They have some cool tricksiness about them, so they have a lot of like ranged, but it's short ranged, but they move pretty well. So you have to like run in, but not run too far in. And there's, you know, there's kind of a lot of play there. The issue is there's not a ton of flexibility. A lot of their sort of fighters have similar strengths and weaknesses. And the Shroud Queen isn't really as distinctive as it could be, sort of mechanically. I'm not a big buyer on that ability. You know, I don't think it's very powerful, and it looks like it should be, which can just be really frustrating in game. But, you know, they're absolutely playable. I know of people who really like them. I'm sure part of that is the aesthetic, but, you know, that tricksiness I think is going to be something that, so, it is sort of just one play style, but it's also going to be something that for a lot of players, you can put yourself in a position where you think that's how you want to play, but then they're so punishing for a single mistake that you very quickly find out that that's not how you wanted to play. That's true of a lot of hit and run factions in a lot of strategy games. It's a play style that can be very fun, but purposefully choosing a play style where you find out about your mistake immediately can be really rough and frustrating for a lot of players. Kharadron Overlords. Really perfect Johnny suite of abilities. Stuff that, a lot of other factions really want as far as what they do, like Fight for Profit, I think is a really cool ability that kind of speaks to their lore really well. Just really amazing. I also think the aesthetic, I actually don't like it, but it's quintessentially AOS, right? Weird, imaginative. I think it represents the setting really, really well in a way that a lot of, not a lot of factions do. They also just have, so I don't think I gushed about sort of their list building abilities quite as much as I should have. They have multiple good chaff options in that they've got a 65-point unit. They've also got this really interesting spearman. They've got a ton of weapon options where the weapons actually matter, like the way the weapons are different actually matter. A lot of factions have weapon options. A lot of like the bespoke factions have weapon options, but the fighter still kind of feels the same regardless of which weapon you've given them. With, say, Thunderers or Balloon Boys, that's just not true. Each weapon is going to feel really different, which gives you just a really incredible array of stuff to do. The one thing that does hold them back, and I think is the only thing that stops them from being S tier, in my opinion, is quality of life issues. For both you and the opponent. So I'll unpack that for each one. So for you, the fact that your cheap models, your chaff, your 65-point or your 80-point models, only move 3 inches, and options for buffing that movement are tough, just makes them hard to use. And the pistols, I think, are only 8-inch range, and so not only is it hard to kind of get them into a fight, but you don't get to take advantage of the range that easily. So they're kind of hard to use for that reason. And yet, even though they're hard to use for you, they can feel completely oppressive and unbeatable for your opponent. And I know that doesn't make sense when you hear me say it, but it is a thing. And a lot of people who play, like, one thing you'll see on the Reddit or on the Discord or even sometimes on the Facebook is, like, people will post being like, how do you ever beat Kharadron Overlords? Like, the gun line of KO is impossible for me to do anything against. And it's because they played 2 games. Both of those games started with the deployment groups within shooting range of each other. They didn't put a lot of terrain on the board, and none of this stuff is obvious to you when you start playing. And so just right away, they just got gunned down because maybe they didn't have a very chaff forward warband, so like it only takes a couple kills to really take out all the teeth of their warband, and so they're all gone really quick. So KO are weirdly like difficult to play and difficult to play against, in a way that I do think from a casual play standpoint does kind of limit them a little bit. Otherwise, I think they're perfect. I think like literally perfect other than that issue, in terms of list building options and memorable abilities and stuff like that. Really amazing. Just, if you're going to play them, be somewhat like, don't start playing war games with Kharadron Overlords and Warcry, and maybe don't play them against someone who's having their first game ever. Both of those are pretty unforgiving. Otherwise, they're amazing, truly amazing. Getting into Khorne Bloodbound, this is another really amazingly put together faction. List building, really easy. When I say really easy on top end and hard on low end, what I mean is powerful Khorne Bloodbound are bounded by having to use Blood Reavers. Now, that doesn't have to be that big a deal, right? You can use Blood Warriors, and they are fairly functional. But they're a little Iron Golem-y in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. Now, that's okay because you have so many leaders, and that's what I mean by list building being easy on top end. You have so many leaders that do interesting things. It's funny, in AOS, Khorne is kind of known for having all these foot heroes that are all traps. In Warcry, that's not true. A ton of them have really good abilities that do really interesting stuff. The Bloodstoker has, a really cool ability, and for real fun, can go into Slaanesh and do some really powerful things in Slaanesh, which is really funny. The Blood Secretor does some really cool stuff. The Wrathmonger champion, I think, is a really cool piece. So just tons of leaders to sink into, which I think is perfect for narrative play. I think in general, the Chaos Mortal factions are like basically all what narrative play in Warcry is about, in terms of like fitting the setting so well. Being mortals kind of gives them sort of more compelling reasons to be there and to be doing some of the kind of Warcry mission sort of things that exist. So I just think that they're just really amazing for kind of the lore and setting of the game. And the fact that they have so many effective leaders makes it so that you can choose a sculpt you love and it'll do really cool, memorable things in game and also be sort of your stamp creatively on the game as well. So I just think that Khorne Bloodbound are just an incredibly designed faction. Not quite in that S tier because I'm saving that for just like the absolute best designed factions in the game, but Bloodbound are amazing in Warcry. I personally don't love them. I don't love their aesthetic compared to the Demon faction, which is one of my favorites in the game. But that's just my thing specifically on the Khorne guy aesthetic. Now going into Khorne Demons though, that is one of my favorites. Unfortunately, my poor Gorehound. I mean, my beautiful boy, my beautiful good boy, Gorehound. What they did to the Gorehound is a crime. It used to be a leader, if you don't know. Kind of early in Warcry, it was a leader. And then when they brought in the Grand Alliance books, they chopped the points by 40 points, making it one of the most powerful fighters in the game. As far as just a single elite fighter, it's probably, in my opinion, the best near 200 point fighter in the game. But they took away the leader keyword, so you can't run a narrative around your Gorehound very easily. Or you can just sort of run a different leader and then claim that the Gorehound is your real leader. But the fact that you're not supposed to do that makes it, like, the fact that the rules tell you not to do that just kind of ruins it, in my feeling. It's the only faction with no leader abilities. So, like, okay, so you're taking away the leader rune mark of the most memorable fighter in the faction. And you're bringing in the Bloodmaster, which I actually think is a really cool sculpt. Mine is one of the worst paint jobs I've ever done, which is too bad. So I have to like look at it whenever I put it on the table. But if you paint it better than I did, you can have a really cool piece in front of you. The problem being they didn't give it an ability. Like, what? So yeah, the fact that they're so ability hamstrung, I just don't get. It just seems like they were purposefully trying to smack me down with Khorne Demons. I don't know. I can't help but laugh. It doesn't, the pieces fit too well together to land them in D tier, despite all of those problems I just mentioned. Mostly just in that Bloodletters are a pretty solid chaff unit competitively. Fleshhounds are They have a ton of play to them. They really reward skillful play, but they're not so fragile that you make one mistake and you're done. And then the Juggernaut Riders, the Blood Crushers, not as powerful, but they have a real role in terms of defensive cavalry that I think is cool. So the pieces, you don't have many options, but the pieces fit together. The options you do have fit together really well. That part is good. It's enough to keep them out of D tier. But oh boy, man, they've had some rough times. Let's go on to Kruleboyz. Kruleboyz are just real solid B. They're really sweet. There's some really fun jank in Kruleboyz if you can get past Potgrot. Now, I know the 8 points are a Potgrot hotspot. Potgrot being, one of the 4 strongest units in the entire game, or fighters, whatever you call them, in the entire game. Potgrot is absolutely top 4 on anyone's list. It does sometimes feel like some of the other stuff in Kruleboyz had to pay a little bit in terms of their power level for how strong Potgrot was. Some of the other stuff in there is kind of on the weaker side. But even though it's on the weaker side, I just kept looking at leaders and seeing like, oh, that one has kind of a cool ability. Oh, that one has a cool ability. Like the Killaboss on Gnashtooth, the giant thing. Now, I made a whole video on how its base is just too big, which is true. If you have terrain-heavy games, you're going to have real base problems with that. But if you have kind of lighter terrain on your board, your Gnashtooth can do really amazing things. The ability is incredible. The Swampcalla Shaman has a really cool ability, so if you are going to have a ton of Potgrots, you can sort of narratively have your Swampcalla Shaman and be doing really interesting things. I think that the Hobgrot Slittas, there's a tweet, I wish I had it so I could put it on screen, but there's a tweet by one of the Warcry rules writers about why they chose the stat line they did for the Hobgrot Slittas to make it feel like they're not shooters, but grenade lobbers. And it really does feel like that in game. I think it's that they don't have a very long range, but they really do a lot of good stuff once you get them into range. They don't have a ton of attacks, but the attacks are sort of meaningful. So, some stuff that just as far as verisimilitude, as far as like fighting on the board the way you would feel like it would, they really nailed it with a lot of the pieces on Kruleboyz, which I think is just really cool. So even though they have a lot of competitive problems once you don't use Potgrots, they have some quality of life issues with the Gnashtooth just being too damn big for the board. Otherwise they function really well, which I think puts them in B tier. Also, their sculpts, obviously brand spanking new. When they came out, a lot of people complained that there was no sense of humor to the Kruleboyz sculpts. Whether you agree with that or not is tough, right? I think there's way too much use of, we put spikes on this to show that it's evil. But those Gut Ripper shields are amazing. I mean, come on, those shields are so cool. So Lumineth Realm Lords, basic high elves. This is another aesthetic that I personally don't love, but it is so popular. People, not me, but just a truly beloved both aesthetic and lineup. Like, not just sort of the idea is popular and the execution is very popular. So I've got to give it a ton of points for that. Just people love this faction in terms of look and feel. Now, for list building, they don't have a true chaff option. So their cheapest option is those wardens, kind of like Deepkin, but even the Deepkin stuff I think is a little bit more usable from a chaff perspective. But everything else is perfect. As far as like wanting to rely on 90-point models goes, it's amazing. This is exactly how you should design an elite force in Warcry. It's perfect. They have strong abilities sort of up and down the leader part of the roster. They have distinctive troops with like real play styles to them, where the Blade Lords being this kind of offensive powerhouse, and mobile offensive powerhouse, versus the Hammer Bros being basically like Ironjawz, but cheap and actually usable, and with the 2-inch range. So they're really slow, but man, do they win their fights. And these are just among the cheap options. The leaders are also pretty powerful. This is the earliest of the factions that came out after GW rethought the leader tax. This is getting into the weeds of Warcry that most people won't be that interested in, but about 3/4 of the factions in the game have a tax on each leader, where if you just look point for point, it's clear that every leader is just put like 20 or 30 points above where they would normally be for that stat line. And they cut that out right at the Lumineth Realm Lords level. It did, in my opinion, create one broken fighter. I think the Lumineth High Sentinel is too good. And its ability is really incredible too. And it's something that, if you're making competitive lists in order in a tournament where allies are allowed, if you have more than 2 shooters in your list, you have to think really hard about not including the High Sentinel. But otherwise, I think, it was a good change. It was mostly a good change for the game, and just makes list building with Lumineth a breeze. There's tons of stuff you can do there, and like I said before, tons of abilities that you can do as well. So yeah, just really well designed faction. If you're going to design a faction with no chaff, you should do it like this. Now, Ogor Mawtribes, pretty sweet. They have at least 4 distinctive playstyles as far as like ways that you can put a warband together that kind of has its own identity on the field. Whether you kind of go with the Icebrow Hunter and Frost Sabers and Yetis, or you can kind of have your double Thunderfist lists with just like double Thunderfist and all Noblars. The Tyrant is a really cool piece that kind of, once you have it on the board, every game revolves around it, because it's got like not a powerful shooting attack, but a decent shooting attack, and then it also just does an incredible amount of damage, and it's really hard to kill. So like the whole game revolves around it, in a way that, if that's how you want to play, is going to be really rewarding to you. Now, they don't have a lot of... I said that they have 4 distinct things that you can do, right, which is really cool. But that's not quite the same as like flexibility and letting you kind of sort of move between those things and have hybrids of those things. That's not quite the same, right? And it's just hard to avoid some Uggo sculpts, right? Like the Tyrant sculpt, in my opinion, is incredible. And the what do you call it? The Icebrow Hunter from Underworlds, you can just bring in as your Icebrow Hunter. That's a pretty new sculpt that I think is a cool ogre. I actually don't like it, but it's like got a lot of detail and modern sensibility around it. But man, like some of the other ones, they're like cute sort of fat baby ogres. So some people I think really love them, but they're very old. And Ogor Mawtribes, the faction, they do have to get docked for the fact that they're kind of Noblar Mawtribes, the faction. It's really hard from a list building standpoint to not include a bunch of Noblars, and man, the Noblar sculpts are awful. They look all wrong with the ogres, in my opinion. So, whether that upsets you or not is up to you. But for me, that's like the flaw in the ointment, that fly in the ointment that sort of keeps them in B tier. Otherwise, they are incredible. They're solid on the table, and they have those 4 play styles, like I said. Now let's get into Nighthaunt. I think, given how mean I was with Fyreslayers and Iron Golems, I think a lot of people would expect me to also put Nighthaunt in D tier, but I really don't think that that's the case. So list building's really hard, as is true with a lot of the kind of weaker competitive factions. List building's really, really hard. And the leader options, the leaders are generally really weak, other than the Knight of Shrouds on Steed, which means narrative is kind of awkward because it's like, in narrative, you want a cool leader who is, you know, putting his stamp or her stamp, putting their stamp on every battle that you play, and that's just not going to happen with Nighthaunt unless you just take your one option that you have. But that said, they have two really fun abilities. The Spindly Ghost that everyone hates putting together, the older one, the ability that kind of explodes its damage potential, I think is really fun. And then they also have that Resurrect ability that I think is really cool. They also, even though they're sort of weak against going into competitive warbands, if your opponent is also playing kind of a janky casual warband, Nighthaunt function pretty well at that point because they're pretty quick and they have flying. So on a heavy terrain table, they just function really well. Like, again, not powerful from a competitive sense, but Nighthaunt never auto lose, for example, right? Like, when you lose eventually, it's because of like your low damage output or the fact that you're like outnumbered on every objective. And, you know, just being fast and defensive is a hard combination in Warcry because Warcry is so sort of weighted towards being able to get to a place and kill something at that place all kind of in one try. But at a casual level, that doesn't matter as much. And the fact that you can move around the board kind of with ease because of your flying, and you can kind of get to whatever objective you need to get to, it just means that you can kind of play your games. As long as you're playing at a low power level, you can play them very comfortably in a way that Fyreslayers, they're weak, but they're weak in a way that's just hard to play with. Whereas Nighthaunt is weak in a way that's just weak, but it's not hard to play with. It's actually really easy to play with. So for that reason, I wouldn't put them, you know, really low in D for that reason. I think the only real sort of issue with them is that list building is impossible. You're kind of, you put some things in your list and then you realize you're all out of room before you fit like half the stuff you want to put in there. The other thing that I think is cool about them is the sculpts are just, you know, beloved by everyone. I mean, when you've seen aesthetic surveys out there, people generally put Nighthaunt in the top 3 or 4 of, you know, prettiest armies in the game. This is another one where the aesthetic isn't for me at all, but it is for so many people that, you know, you gotta give it some props. Nurgle Demons. Nurgle was kind of the first meme. Nurgle Rotbringers are kind of a total meme faction. But the demons are pretty solid and playable in certain ways. Now, one issue. So, okay, Sloppity Bilepiper, really cool. Gives everyone movement around it. The only issue is, so we've got some kind of flexibility traps, right? Where you have a ton of list options with this warband, right? Because you've got your 50-point Plague Bearers, but then you've also got like Beasts of Nurgle and Nurglings and Plague Drones, and all 3 of those are like pretty playable in the game. You've got a bunch of different leader options, and the issue being Plague Bearers kind of really need Sloppity Bilepiper to function. So then, and they're the thing that gives you a ton of list flexibility where you can build functional, interesting lists with all the other toys too. And so then the question is, do you even have a faction without Sloppity to where, like, I can't put them any higher than B because they just have that issue. The other thing about having so many list options is you can really, I call it self-NPE, right? Now, Fyreslayers, right, they kind of have this all the time. Sorry, I'm just going to dump on Fyreslayers so much. I'm so sorry, Fyreslayers players. But they can cause self-NPE if you don't have Sloppity in your list, because Sloppity fixes their movement problem, but it's the only thing that's doing it. And so you kind of have to have one of your deployment groups is Sloppity plus a bunch of Plague Bearers, which does kind of limit you in terms of the play styles you've got at your fingertips. But you know, the elite pieces that you do have available to you are really cool, and you get a ton of options with them, which I think is great. And then Plague Bearers plus Sloppity is just like a thing that works, and you can find people who have played it sort of all on the internet, and they'll tell you like you can make some really functional stuff there with a lot of play to it. So yeah, that's basically the definition of a B tier faction, right? Unfortunately, their mortal ones are one of the classic Warcry memes. Massive list building and flexibility limitations. Not as weak as some of the factions in the game, but just really rough because of that 3-inch move everywhere. Now they do have the Bell guy that can sort of boost up some move, but the problem is they aren't just really slow, but they also, their cheapest unit is like 135 points. Like you just can't build lists with them in any kind of flexible way. Like the points just don't work. Like you end up with 1050 points, or then okay, so you try to reconfigure and then you have like 970, or not 9 but like 930, and you've got 70 points left, and you're like, oh, what do I do with this? So they're just probably the most frustrating faction in the game to build lists for, honestly. And unfortunately, the abilities don't really make up for that, right? The Bell, not even a hero, by the way, but the Bell is really solid, but that's just like an ability that's trying to make up for an insufficiency. And with Sloppity, kind of the same ability, but Sloppity's ability, because that faction has cheaper things, is providing more movement, because if you have this AoE movement buff and you have one other sculpt that falls in your AoE, you're adding movement, like that much movement, whereas Sloppity is adding like so many more inches of movement total across your team, right? The one thing that props them up, I think puts them above some of the other things, is the Blight Lord on the Fly, the Fly leader, is actually pretty powerful in its own right. I think it makes it so that competitively this faction is sort of better off than a lot of the other awful to list build with factions. It's a really solid narrative hero, so if that's what you're into, you can play it, and it will be one of those things where once you've got a couple artifacts on it, every game it's in will revolve around it, which, I think just narrative games are just so cool when you have a hero that you can really rely on. And Nurgle absolutely does have that hero. So that is one saving grace. So if you're one of the many people, this is another one with beloved sculpts that I don't like, but if you're one of the many people who love the Nurgle kind of aesthetic, you can at least kind of put together a narrative campaign, and it's going to be really weak. It's going to be really frustrating if you like to win. But if you just want to see your hero do some cool stuff, you can actually do that with Nurgle. Ossiarch Bone Reapers are kind of just squeezing out of D. They have a very inflexible roster because Mortec are so hard to play with, being slow and expensive. However, what saves them is that they have really cool elite options that are good in game. Now, it's really, really hard to fit multiples of them in a list. And by this, what I really mean is the Stalkers are really cool, and the, I think it's Morghast, are also really cool. Morghast are one of those where I'm kind of surprised they're in Warcry because they're so big. But both of those elites are really cool, can do a ton of stuff in the game. It's just really hard to fit them in lists because you don't have a cheap fighter, and those are really expensive. Like Stalkers are 200 points, Morghasts are even more. And neither of them have a leader. Like there's no Stalker leader, there's no Morghast leader, and so you have to first, put in a leader, then you put in your Stalker or your Morghast, and then you look up at how many points you have left, and it's like almost nothing, and you've only put one Stalker in. So that's really the frustration with them, but the fact that the Stalker is so functional, that the Morghast is so functional, I think is great. They've also got this all-new line that, I think they could have done more with it, honestly, but there's some really sweet stuff in there, and I think, just as far as like a faction where everything is new, I think that definitely gives them some points. So, in C tier as one of those, very playable if you love them, but you have to love them to play them. One of those. All right, Stormcast Vanguard. For some reason, because in my spreadsheet I defined them differently, they are in a different place alphabetically than the other Stormcast. But basically, they're kind of another classic C tier, despite being really competitive lists. So the Birds, Aetherwings, 45 points, single-handedly win every mission they're in. In my opinion, the second most powerful fighter in the entire game. The Birds make list building really easy. Even 3 birds in a list is going to give you something pretty functional. You put 1 in every deployment group. No matter what you have a 10-inch fighter. No matter what like deployment setup you end up with, you have a 10-inch fighter or a 10-inch flyer. They also have a few really compelling heroes. The Lord Aquiller, I think, is really cool. The Night Venator is amazing. The Hurricane Raptor leader, I think, is like a really solid shooting leader. What is the generic Knave Black Talon? The Knight Zephyros, I think, is kind of interesting. Those all work. The issue is, if you're not playing with Birbs, they have all the same issues that I'm going to talk about with all the other Stormcast, where just list building without Birbs is impossible unless you sort of Gryph-hound spam, and there's a little bit of docking of points there because Gryph-hounds and Aetherwings are not Stormcast, right? So these are certainly much more playable than all the other Stormcast, but there's just issues there. The other thing that I kind of have an issue with is that their sculpts, and I'm going to dock all the Stormcast for this because they have really recent sculpts all across the line that somehow don't hold up. I feel like all the sculpts for Stormcast from before they figured out what Stormcast proportions are actually supposed to be just kind of look weird on the table. They're just like so chunky, and I get that that's what it's supposed to be. It's these like incredible Thor godmen. But I don't know, those early ones like Liberators and some of the Vanguard stuff, I just feel like it hasn't aged well, especially when you look at kind of the Thunderstrike stuff that's out there. Now, on to Scions of the Flame. They get more options than a lot of the bespoke warbands because they do actually have some reasonable chaff options. Unfortunately, their abilities are awful. Their abilities, their stat lines make it so that Onslaught is really good on them. So like the Blazing Lord and the Brazen Champion, the ones with just like one really big weapon, they take Onslaught really well, which from kind of a out-of-the-box playability standpoint is kind of good. Like, Scions of the Flame are kind of what Iron Golems should have been as a learning faction. They get some points for that. The issue is that their abilities, like, I even did a video once where I kind of mathed out these abilities and showed that, like, they're pretty much always worse than the generic ability at the same dice value, which is just really disappointing, in my opinion. It's not always. There is actually like a going against 1 toughness given if with your Brazen Champion, not toughness equals 1, but I think it's like toughness 5 with your Brazen Champion, then you would use it instead of Onslaught. But in general, the abilities, like the correct heuristic for them is to just never use them. So that, I think, is really a shame, and I can't promote them any higher than C because of it. But I do think that the sculpture and detail is really incredible on them. I think that the armor is really cool, the fire coming out of weird places. I actually do have time for it. I think it's kind of cool. So yeah, just a lot of stuff with that that's sweet. They are the villains of the one of the 2 Warcry novels. And they really work as villains. You really hate them. I'll say that much. They're incredibly hateable in the narrative, and I think, some people like that. Some people like playing the villains. Lizardmen, Seraphon, Dino Boys. You get a ton of list options and playstyles, as many as any of the A tier factions. Skinks with blowpipes are really powerful, but you also have Saurus warriors as a chaff unit that a lot of warbands would be happy to put in their lists and give them flexibility. You have a ton of different options around like your knights, your flyers. Just some people get randomly fascinated with Kroxigors and wanting to make them work. Kroxigors are a bit of a trap, by the way, but that's okay, right? As long as you go into it knowing it's a trap, and it being a faction with lots of stuff that isn't a trap, having a few traps in there is okay. So a lot of cool stuff there. Different playstyles. Like if you have a Slaanesh in your list, your playstyle is going to be totally different than if you don't. For example, a lot of cool stuff there. One issue is really old sculpts everywhere. The really cool stuff in Seraphon that holds up 100%, like the Bastillodon, the Old Blood on Carnosaur, and of course Lord Croak being brand new. All of that stuff makes it so that Seraphon and AOS, it feels like even though they're old, they still hold up because they just look incredible because of their monsters. You don't get the monsters in Warcry, and Seraphon without the monsters, again, this is just an opinion thing. I think Seraphon without the monsters just looks kind of lame, because a lot of the sculpts don't hold up. Now, this video is being made as if you're not just going to 3D print everything. If you 3D print Seraphon, they're either top of A or bottom of S. But, some of the dated sculpts that you've got out there just really do bring them down that far. I would also say that their leaders are kind of bad. The Slaanesh is good, but the Slaanesh has this thing where it just feels wrong in Warcry, where a Slaanesh should be this incredible wizard that just blows everything out of the water, in terms of lore, in terms of, how they play in AOS. It should be like a 500-point model with 3 abilities that do impossibly scary things. It's not that. It costs fewer points in Warcry than it does in AOS. Like, it makes no sense at all. It does basically nothing in this game. I mean, okay, it has a really cool ability that teleports, and it uses, we'll get to this in Stormcast, but it uses Stormcast better than Stormcast do. So in-game, it's actually very solid. But in terms of how it feels as far as, like, how a Slaanesh should feel on the battlefield, it just doesn't feel like a Slaanesh. So it doesn't get quite as many points there as it should. But, I'm like way up and down here on them, right? But that's because they're just that exact B tier of, some real big flaws here, but some really incredible stuff to make up for it. Going into Skaven, this is another one where they just have an incredible array of troop options beyond just the competitive choices, right? You can go all Scryer, you could go all Eshin, you could go all Molder, although that would actually be pretty competitive. You can do a ton of different stuff. Now, one issue with them is their leaders are either hyper-competitive combo pieces or absolutely terrible. And there's nothing in between, which can be really frustrating when you're building lists. So it's really easy to build Skaven lists because you have giant rats, which are amazing, and you've got plague monks that are amazing. And so it's really easy to build competitive lists because there's a lot of really powerful competitive pieces in Skaven. But can be really hard to build like cool narrative lists with Skaven because of what I said of their leaders just being either competitive combo pieces or awful. And so it's like their list building isn't as sweet as it should be. I mean, maybe I should just say what I said for Corvus Cabal, where it's like they're either good or there's not much to them, except that they do have more than Corvus does in terms of list building goes, right? They've got all these different branching places you can go with it. You can make bad Skaven lists if you try hard enough. But the issue, the thing that Corvus has that they don't is new sculpts, and the Skaven range is pretty rough. Even in some of them where they can hold up. For example, I bought a box of Plague Monks. There are, like, the flowing robes kind of look okay with Plague Monks, even though they're so static. The issue is, and I've never complained about mold lines in any other sort of Games Workshop piece. Even when they are there, I don't shave them off usually. I don't have a problem. But man, are the Plague Monk mold lines rough. And, you know, on some of the other stuff, like the Rat Ogre is just so ugly. So this is another one where, you know, they go up into high B tier if you're just 3D printing them. And of course, you know, Storm Fiends are incredible. But otherwise, you know, man, they're old. And they're old to the point of not just being, I think, less pretty than other factions, but like legitimately harder to work with and harder to put on the table because of how old they are. So that can be an issue. They also lose a few points here for being a bit of an eye roll faction. People generally in the community know how broken Skaven are, so you bring out your Skaven and, you know, your opponent's going to be like, oh, whatever, you brought Skaven. So that's the thing that can happen, and I do think that kind of docks you a few points on a casual tier list. So let's get into the Slaanesh slide. Demons of Slaanesh, amazing, flawless. They have the most memorable ability in the game. Now, some people consider it a bit of an NPE thing, right? The Contorted Epitome can just lock down a hero so it can't do anything. But boy, is it memorable. It is the Contorted Epitome as far as making a game revolve around an epic hero model, does that better than any other piece in the game, bar none. And I think that is enough to get it into S tier. However, you've also got, you know, Demonettes are an incredibly playable model, right? Moving 5 inches, chopping things up pretty well. Fiends are just a really, you know, playable model. They do a lot of stuff on the board. You do have some options beyond the competitive build, right? You can play with your Seekers. You can play with the Mortal Seekers that are old sculpts are kind of rough. I wouldn't suggest anyone play with them. I hated putting them together, but the ones with the whips, pretty solid in the game. So you can do a lot with Demons of Slaanesh from a playing point of view. You can also have a lot of leader options that are really solid, like even past the Contorted Epitome, like the Blissbringer is really solid. That's the Fiend leader. The Harpist is really good. Has a really interesting ability that is really fun. So just a lot you can do with Slaanesh. Me putting them in S tier is maybe being a little bit biased, but I don't think so. I think that they're just really amazing. They're another faction that's not very popular. So I'm giving them points for having like brand new sculpts everywhere across the board except on their Seekers. But yeah, not everyone agrees with me, and I get it. Now, Slaanesh Sybarites. That's the Mortals. Like every other Mortal crew, I think narratively they're perfect for the game. These are Chaos Mortals. I think narratively they're amazing. The one issue is Blissbarbies, whatever you call them, the Blissbarb Archers, they make for really awkward list building, like really awkward, really difficult. It's hard. This is another one where it's just hard to put pieces together and be happy with it. Like by the time you've built a list, you're like, but that's it? This is all I get? And what is especially a kick in the pants is that Blissbarbs cost 5 more than the Lumineth Archers and then the Sea Elf Archers, but they do less, which is crazy to me, right? Like Reavers are 5 points less than Blissbarbs, and they have an extra point of movement. You know, Lumineth have 5 points cheaper than Blissbarbs, and they have crazy buff abilities that can make their Reavers sort of do more. Blissbarbs do have a buff ability, but mathematically it just does so little for them. It's better on the Blissbarb leader isn't an embarrassment. The Blissbarb leader is okay. And that kind of gets me into, just in general, they have actually really good leaders. The Ego Pomp has a cool ability. The Fiend Blood leader is amazing. The Lord of Pain is amazing. The Shard Speaker is amazing. The high, the shooter leader at least gets something out of that ranged buff. So your leader options are really excellent with this faction, and to me that's what really brings them up into B tier is, for narrative games, you just have so many good options that you can kind of make your own. They also have this brand new line. Every sculpt in the line is brand new, except for that one. The one on the old Seeker is pretty bad, but everything else in the line is brand new and some of the coolest stuff they've ever done. You also do have those really amazing, like Fiend Bloods are exactly what they should be in AOS. They are it in Warcry, and I do give it points for that. It's something that, why they couldn't do it in AOS, I don't know, but in Warcry, Fiend Bloods do exactly what you think they would do, and I think that's really cool. So yeah, they just get docked for their bad list building, but otherwise I think they're an incredibly, interesting, fun faction. They also are getting points from me for having Underworld Warband rules. Their Underworld Warband is really good in Warcry, and that kind of makes them a little bit more playable in list building than they would be otherwise, and I think is really great. Okay. All right, we are deep into our second hour here. I am losing my voice, but we've only got a few more things left. Slaves to Darkness, the best lineup of narrative heroes of any faction. Really amazing. Now, most of them are all foot heroes, except for Varanguards, which are really cool. So I think for that reason, that's kind of a real saving grace for them. However, really hard to build a Slaves to Darkness list without including Marauders, because Chaos Warriors are kind of painfully bad. And Marauders are, in my opinion, the ugliest sculpt in the entire game. In all of Warcry, they are the ugliest sculpt. They cannot be higher than C tier. Now, this is another one where secret A tier if you have alternate proxies that you like. Because once you're using Marauders, you do get some really solid list building options. You've got Kagra's Ravagers, which is the Underworld Warband that has that cool teleport. A lot of cool stuff you can do with Slaves to Darkness. They do have serious movement problems, which, again, Kagra's Ravagers kind of solve a little bit with that teleport. But yeah, so they have, they have play to them. A lot of fun stuff you can do, a lot of really cool narrative in the game because like the 8 points is their home. So the entire game is just set in the Slaves to Darkness house. It's just those Marauders. I cannot bring them higher than C tier until they get updated Marauders, or until like Marauders are kicked out of the game for something else. I don't know what it is. Just get those Marauders away from me. Soulblight Gravelords. Tons of cool builds you can do with them. It's because you can flip between zombies and skeletons, and then you also have your Graveguard. There's like a mix of really competitive choices and really casual choices. You can do your whole Cursed City stuff with Soulblight Gravelords. Yeah, just an incredible array of stuff. One of the best designed factions in Warcry for sure. You have some really solid leader options, like the Vampire Lord is good, the Vargoyle is good. Yeah, a lot of stuff you can do. The Castellan isn't bad if you're willing to go into mounted stuff. It is kind of hard to avoid a weak sculpt or two, because even though they got like a big range refresh, they didn't hit every single sculpt. So like Graveguard are really ugly, which is too bad since they're your most powerful unit. There are some issues there, but overall just like a really amazing faction. One of my less favorite aesthetics, but it's all new, and I actually do think that the Vampire Lord is amazing. You also there's an Underworld Warband that doesn't have rules for Warcry, but it does have a bunch of Vampire Lord options. So you can personalize this faction to high heaven in a really cool way. Spire Tyrants. I do not like Spire Tyrants. They've done generic barbarians 3 times in Warcry. And I think Spire Tyrants are the weakest execution of the 3. And so I'm just not giving them the points I would normally give factions for having new cool sculpts. They also just don't have any really interesting tricks at all. They do have a decent chaff unit, which makes it so that if you buy 3 boxes of Spire Tyrants, you can actually build a pretty powerful warband. But it's just a worse version of other powerful warbands because their abilities are so terrible. That, like, why wouldn't you just do something similar in a different faction? I don't know, man. And then, like, Rito owns Spire Tyrants, and that's a YouTuber who one of kind of the first big Warcry YouTuber who would kind of go through everything. And one thing he would talk about a lot is just how frustrating Spire Tyrants are to play with. Yeah, I just can't put them any higher than D tier. Now, Splintered Fang, on the other hand, really cool and one of the better designed sort of bespoke factions. Now, there is this issue of, like, do you make it snake-based or do you not? However, they've got some pretty playable, interesting stuff that isn't snakes, and they've got some 5-inch move without snakes, and they've got some cool abilities sort of with and without snakes. So they definitely get points for having 2 play styles in one bespoke faction. They just can't go that high because their leader's not that memorable. Which again, for narrative play, I feel like you just really want your leader to be memorable. And for these, they just don't have it. So they can't go like way up high into the high tiers, but they are a very playable faction in a lot of different ways. And man, even if I think their leader is a little disappointing, the snake collar with the snake going, like wrapping around his arms, I think is really amazing. All right, so we're into the meat of the Stormcast. Stormcast Sacrosanct. They have Thundercats. That's pretty cool. Otherwise, they just have major list building problems. Like, other than Gryph-hounds, there's just not a cheap unit that you actually want to play. It's impossible to get more than 5 in here. Yeah, it's rough. Thundercats are really cool. Maybe put them in a different faction. I don't know. The other thing that's really frustrating... So, Soul Wars was one of my... Like, the Stormcast half of Soul Wars was one of my introductions to the hobby. And so, Sacrosanct was one of the first things I played in Warcry after I was done playing my Iron Golems versus Untamed Beasts, and then I got the Wrath and Rapture box, which was Slaanesh versus Khorne. I played that. And then I got the half of the Soul Wars box and played my Sacrosanct, and was just so sad because there's just nothing you can... There's no play to them. The abilities are terrible. I looked at that... I was kind of a new Timmy kind of player. Looked at that quad where it's like... do some damage all around, and I tried it, and then it was like it did no damage all around. So they're awful. They're awful. One of the least playable factions in the whole game, even though they do have one cool fighter. Thunderstrike, though, is them, very recent. It's them kind of acknowledging a lot of the issues that are endemic to Stormcast in a bunch of ways. One, they finally figured out the Stormcast aesthetic, which they had kind of been inching towards with Sacrosanct. I do think the Sacrosanct sculpts are much better than the Warrior Chamber or the Vanguard sculpts. But Thunderstrike, they like actually figured it out, which is great. I actually like unironically like Stormcast now, in a way that I couldn't before. They also have a bunch of quality of life improvements over the Mages and Warriors. Things like a lot of 2-inch reach everywhere to make up for how slow they are. They clearly, like, they tweaked the toughness algorithm a little bit so that, the toughness 6 and 7 fighters are still pretty bad, but the toughness 5 fighters aren't paying quite as badly. So that's pretty good. The sword, the Vigilors are, I think that's the sword one. No, that's the bow one. But the sword fighters are really good. They've got two different fighters that are around Gryph-hound points cost, which actually lets you functionally get 6 Stormcast into a list, which finally, right? The reason that they don't rise above C tier is like, we're finally getting 6 in a list and actually being able to function, right? But they're only just functional. So much better than the other Stormcast, but still, not great. But, all of the C tier factions, again, are factions that are very, very playable if you like them. If you already like them, they're very playable and casual, usable. I don't mean playable in terms of power. I mean like just very usable and fun if you love them. But they won't be fun if you don't love them. So just a thing to remember. Stormcast Eternal Warriors barely go above Sacrosanct. Again, they've got the oldest sculpts. I actually think some of their heroes look okay because they're just like so overdone in kind of an interesting way. But their list building is just impossible. Just so, unless you're going to just have all Gryph-hounds, but then that's not Stormcast, right? That being said, they do have a few fighters that are really good. Like the Prosecutor with the big sword, if that were in a playable, like list buildable faction, people would talk about the Prosecutor with the big sword as like one of the premier dragons in the game. They also have a few really beefy heroes that win their fights that if you ally them into Seraphon or Tempest Eye, can do some really cool work. So if you have Stormcast warriors that you love, play Lizard People, play Tempest Eye, Cities of Sigmar, and you can use them. But man, list building with regular Stormcast is really tough. They have all the mobility problems, all of that. Obviously Thunderstrike and Vanguard don't have that issue, but man, Sacrosanct and Warriors can be rough. Sylvaneth, I think one of the best designed factions in the game. They have reasonable options at every point in the curve. 50-point Tree Revenants, which, okay, so they're kept out of S tier a little bit with this for me because Tree Revenants don't look like they should be 50 points. They're elves. They should be 70, 80 points. There should just be more to them. Spite Revenants are 70 points. Really solid unit. Dryads are really solid, but you kind of have to spam them to do it. But that's okay because it's like it gives you different play styles to mess around with them. They also have like Kurnoth Hunters are really different from the Arch Revenant in terms of your top end. Yeah, just a lot of really cool options, a lot of stuff you can play around with. They also just, every sculpt is either very recent or it just holds up really well. And I think that that's huge points for me. You're not going to have a single ugly model in your warband, which for casual play for me is like really important. So yeah, just another one of these perfect factions. All of these A tier factions are just, I think, perfect for playing casual games of Warcry where it doesn't matter too much who wins. But where it does matter a little bit, right? None of these factions are sort of among the weakest in the game. And they're all just incredibly playable in tons of different ways. You can just sink into so much with Sylvaneth. All right, we're almost at the end. Tarantulos Brood. You do have two different playstyles. You can either spider spam or you can rely mostly on your regular fighters. The one issue with that is that their abilities kind of demand that you run at least 2 spiders, which makes it so that if you want to have reasonable Tarantulos, it's kind of hard. If you don't know, spiders are the strongest fighter in the game, by a lot. I do think the sculpts are really cool for the most part. The problem is, spiders, again, strongest fighter in the game, have the ugliest sculpt I've seen from a Games Workshop product in, I can't remember. Like, there are uglier sculpts, absolutely, but from anything made in the last 5 years, no, probably not. anything made in the last 10 years. I guess I don't know how far back 10 years really is with GW. But at least since I've been paying attention to GW sculpts, they have never produced an uglier model than the spider that is in Tarantulos, which is a shame because the Tarantulos fighters, like the humans, are really amazing. Really dynamic poses. They feel spidery, really cool. They're also getting docked a little bit for being eye roll inducing in that, you know, if you rock up with more than 3 spiders, your opponent will give you a look. That said, you know, they have all these options. They're pretty quick around the board. They have a really cool, well-built set of abilities. It's just that it leans you towards maximizing them to be super powerful. So it's like, it's really good and really playable and really fun. It can be tough. It keeps them out of A because it can be tough to kind of play them into different levels of play, which can be kind of frustrating for you and your opponent. Now, the Unmade, they're an absolute statement faction as far as like aesthetics go. They have some of the most distinctive, I mean, the main hero, right, with those like scythes for arms and pogo sticks for legs, just incredibly memorable. And it's also really powerful. It's one of the very few leaders from an original, one of the original 6 warbands, where the leader is actually good. That basically never happens. So they also, okay, so they are one-trick ponies, but I'm not docking them points for it here because the trick is really cool, right? It's about just going buck wild with your leader, and everything in the warband either protects your leader or empowers your leader. You would think that would be a kind of repetitive and bad, but one, when you really look at the abilities and see how they go together, it's really impressive. And then the protecting the leader stuff is also just good control elements in general. So you get this kind of combo control playstyle. But also, when you talk to people who really play them, you don't need to have your whole warband dedicated to this purpose. And so they're actually a really good home for bringing in a really cool ally that you like. There's a ton of different like conversion potential that you've got there, right? Because Unmade are so distinctive that there's just a ton of hobby stuff you can do as far as bringing in your ally. And then like allies that are just sort of self-contained, powerful actors, whether it's like the Tzeentch guy or the Doom Bull, stuff like that, just fit perfectly into Unmade. So if you just like get a box of Unmade, kick out 2 of your fighters and bring in like a really powerful chaos monster, not literal monster, but like one of those monster heroes, you can have just a ton of fun with your Unmade warband. So I think that they're just a really excellent, you know, one of the best designed, I think, bespoke warbands that they've ever done. Let's get into our last final slide, Tzeentch and Untamed Beasts. So Tzeentch Demons. Do you like pink horrors? No? Pass. Split is a very memorable ability, right? So they're going to be at the top of D tier because Split, you do remember it. Now, how they play is really crazy because they, it's incredibly matchup dependent, right? Can your opponent play around Split? Yes, you will feel like you're not doing anything. If they can't, you will crush them. Now, Tzeentch Demons and Tzeentch Khainites are both going to get sort of docked a little bit for, you know, other than Split, they have awful abilities as far as like actually feeling like Tzeentch. Neither of them do. Now, Tzeentch Demons do have some cool, really expensive demons that give them kind of some play, although there's real list building sort of flexibility issues there. Tzeentch Khainites, on the other hand, have a lot more flexibility in that Zangor are very playable. You get Kyric Acolytes, which are very weak, but are very playable. Like, you will lose a lot of games playing Kyric Acolytes, but they do their thing. They do it, like, they execute their thing that's just not very strong. And then their leader options are amazing. Like, both of the disc leaders, the Skyfire leader, the Enlightened leader are really good. The other guy on a disc is really good. They have just all these incredible beat sticks. They're just like a really powerful, really interesting faction that a lot of people love, but just they don't play like Tzeentch. So I can't put them in A tier, even though I would like to. And same with Tzeentch Demons. Like, I can't put them really in C tier, although they're a little Tzeentchier. But just because their abilities are terrible, like terrible, except for the Enlightened leader's sort of self-damage pump ability, which makes no sense in Tzeentch, right? Tzeentch shouldn't be about like hitting as hard as possible. Tzeentch should be about like, anyway. So they don't play like Tzeentch. So I think that that's a real disadvantage there, but there's a ton of play to Tzeentch mortals, just in a vacuum if you throw out the lore. Untamed Beasts are right up there with Unmade as like a just flawless bespoke warband. I think, this is the other of the three sort of generic barbarians, but having them be like sort of back to the land barbarians, I think is just gorgeous. I think it's an iconic look. They have two distinct play styles, which again, really hard to do with these out of the box warbands, but really cool to see. And that you can either focus on the lion combo or not, right? Some of their weak fighters are really interesting. Like, the first Fang is awful in terms of like point for point efficiency for what it does, but man, is that ability cool, right? So there's a lot to love there. The only flaw really with Untamed Beasts is that their leader is bad. If their leader was good, I would put them up in S tier probably, because I just think that there's, in the way that Iron Golems are a very good starter faction because they are simple, Untamed Beasts are a perfect starter faction because the way in which they are complicated is like a perfect invitation to investigate more about the game. So really, just other than that leader being so terrible point for point, yeah, it's just perfect, right? You can build them without the leader being bad. They would be competitive. Or you can kind of build them kind of crazy, right? All over the place. They've got these elite guys that, again, pretty weak in game, but really fun in game, right? With the sawtooth blade and that axe with teeth coming out, stuff like that. So this is just a really user-friendly faction. One where buying 2 boxes of Untamed Beasts makes a ton of sense. You really get rewarded for doing it. So just a ton to love about Untamed Beasts. Absolutely adore them. So we get finally into the final list. Man, I think this one might almost be 2 hours. Probably my longest video by a lot. My voice is totally shot, but I'm just so happy to finally sort of get into this. I've been wanting to kind of think of a way to talk about all these factions from kind of a casual, fun standpoint for a long time. And here it is. I'd love to hear in the comments if you got this far. Hopefully, maybe you bounced around a little bit. I don't know. But if you stuck with me this whole time, thank you so much. Please hit me with a like button. Maybe subscribe a little bit if you haven't already. And let me know, like, if there's... I'm just really interested if there's any disagreement at all or any, like, agreement. Like, what do you love about these S and A tier factions? What do you hate about them? Are there any of these D tier factions that you've had a ton of fun with in game? Let me know, because these are ones where I just like can't see a way in really. Although I have played with, man, maybe I was a little mean to Tzeentch Demons, because I have played a game with Tzeentch Demons where they were not my favorite, but they had a couple fighters that did things. Maybe putting them in D tier was a little mean. Like the Screamers kind of do things. Maybe you could have like an elite Screamer heavy version of them. Their shooter is really good. But man, list building with them is so hard. I don't know. I don't know if I did demons right or not in Tzeentch, but let me know what you think. This is, you know, the entire breadth of Warcry factions, which is way more than AOS factions, right? Because we've got all those bespoke bands. So it's February now. I'm going to be starting in on some sort of heavier competitive content. I'm going to try to clear off my table to do some play testing for Adepticon. Really excited about it. So that's going to be some of the future stuff. I do have one other sort of plan for a very loosey-goosey casual sort of approach to a video that I'm really looking forward to, but that's going to be like one punctuation among like some more competitive tournament prep that I'm pretty excited for. So yeah, until then, may all your rolls be crits.